Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope the day is going well for you. 2 days ago, though it was virtually, but I attended a conference organized by Professor Tudor Parfitt, one of my mentors, whom I studied under at the Florida International University. Among the organizers were Professor Nathan DeVere and Professor Michael Alexander, whom I studied under at the University of California, Riverside. Unfortunately, I could not travel down to Miami, Florida, but I couldn't stay away from a colloquium organized by these three great individuals I mentioned. So I did my best to attend virtually and speak at this conference entitled Jews on the Fringes. I decided to go and tell the story of the African Jews and Jews of Africa. You get it? African Jews and Jews of Africa. The title of my presentation was "They Made and Put the quote African Jews on the radar of the Jewish world. They helped to form the African Jews." The work of distinguished Professor Tudor Parfitt, primarily on the Lamba people of Southern Africa, contributed to the formation of an emerging ethnic group with the name, quote, African Jews, and brought knowledge of their existence to academics and Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Jews, and Israelis. And these groups I mentioned began to see that people who have been linked to stories about Jews existed in Africa at this particular time that we are talking about. I was therefore pleased when Professor DeVere had penciled me down to present a paper based on this, which I thought about when he asked me to contribute to Tudor's first script. First script is testimonial, a book that will talk about his work. I think that the work that Parfitt has done is very important, and in my view, it is worthy of celebration. The story is also about Kulanu Inc., which is the group that its boots have been longest on the ground in Africa as far as the, quote, African Jews are concerned. Kulanu's president, the indefatigable Nathan Sussman, who stands on the shoulders of his founding president, the visionary Jack Zeller. I have my reasons for saying that Jack Zeller is a visionary. Both of us had a vision for the people of Israel, and I believe that that vision will still be realized in days to come. And her immediate successor, the tireless but now departed Harriet Bograd, stands here with us today to accept the honor that I believe that Kulanu merited. Bonita was there. Without Kulanu Inc., I do not know if the African Jews would have become a fact. I believe they would have become like the myriad groups that the Hebraisms of West Africa by Joseph Williams, S.J., talked about in that famous book that is largely discredited now. This guy basically called everybody in the world a Jew. But the problem with his work is that you go to those places he mentioned that these people lived, you do not find even one. But the work of Kulanu and the work of Parfitt helped to establish these African Jews. And people can now go to Uganda, go to Kenya, go to Cameroon, and find people actually practicing what could be identified as Judaism. So the question now arose, who are these African Jews? This is a group which includes members of the various Ugandan ethnic groups that have become the now famous Abayodaya of Uganda. 14 different nations, Africans, came together and formed the Abayodaya, and gradually they left Christianity, did not accept Islam, and moved into a religion that could be identified as Rabbinic Judaism. The member of Zimbabwe and South Africa, the groups that have become the Jews of Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Cameroon, Kenya, Madagascar, and many others. It is important to note that some members of some of the ethnic groups who are among the 300 different ethnic groups that constitute Nigerians may qualify to belong to the category of African Jews. These great people are not the Igbo people, i.e., the nation traditionally addressed as Ibiri, and which we have known as the Jews of Africa. Note the distinction. There are African Jews and Jews of Africa. The Igbos constitute the group called the Jews of Africa. That was what they were called. And this was so many decades ago. So many decades ago, before the identity of African Jews became a reality or became something that people began to use a few years ago, a group had existed in Africa which was called the Jews of Africa, and these are the Igbo people. As I had noted before, the African Jews are seen as distinctively Jewish groups presently because of, to some extent, the efforts of Parfitt, some scholars who followed his footsteps, and Kulanu Inc. How should we honor Parfitt, the code theory that he has inspired Kulanu Inc., and at the same time help both the groups in discussion and the Jews who, according to the theme of this conference, are not on the fringes? You know what fringes mean? Marginal. I mean primarily the groups we broadly call the Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardi Jews, and Israelis, that is white Jews. As scholars, I propose that we should improve on our studies of Jews. Parfitt and other great people like Michael Alexander, whom I have mentioned, who was my mentor at the University of California, Riverside, Jack Zeller, that I have also mentioned, the founding president of Kulanu, Herman Storick, who basically became like a father to me. He is now departed. Andrea Spindel, like a big sister to me, a Canadian Jew. Nathan Devia, who is my brother in Jewish studies, and in the world of Israel, William Miles, who has done a book on this phenomena vis-a-vis Nigeria. Jeff Lieberman has done a film on this phenomena. I call it phenomena because of obvious reasons. Nathan Katz, who worked with Tudor Parfitt to make my presence in America a reality. Walter Isaac, philosopher, who is also very active in the field of Jewish studies. Yehonatan Elazar Mota, who led the Beit Din, that is the Jewish court, that removed the blot on the face of the Jewish world. I will take out a minute and talk about this blot. In spite of the relations that the Igbo people and the Jewish people enjoyed not so long ago, when the state of Israel had very few friends in the world, the Igbo people accepted the state of Israel, treated its citizens in Nigeria as their own, protected them. The state of Israel and the state of Israel has not done enough to show that it recognizes what happened, and has gone even further to deny that the Igbo people came from Israel. Where it has not engaged in outright denial, it has kept quiet. And because it has kept quiet, mischievous anti-Semites have stepped into the breach and contributed to confusion of identity of the Igbo people who have suffered a series of genocides. Yehonatan Elazar Mota, doctor, rabbi, constituted the dean which ruled that the Igbo people are linear descendants of the biblical Israelites. You know what this means? Well, we will not get into that now, but if you want to know more, look at the term Omenana, which is the only name for the religion and culture of the Igbo people. Then look at Deuteronomy 6:1. My position, not even theory, because what you call theory is what is still debatable, is that you cannot even understand the Hebrew Bible unless you know the Igbo language and you understand the Igbo culture. Omenana. Edith Bruder, Joan Brown, Joanna Martin, Lewis Gordon, Yirmiyahu Danzig, Harry Rosenberg, Daniel Lees. You know Daniel Lees? His history of the Igbo Israelite heritage is one of the works you can actually call, one of the very extremely few works you can call reliable as far as Igbo history is concerned. Bonit Anat and Sussman, the president of Kulani that I have mentioned, Sabrina Shmon Samedi, the secretary of Olauda Equiano Research Institute, the educational arm of the Igbo institution called Omenana Defenders. These are the groups that are breaking ground as far as studies of African Jews are concerned. We need to water this ground that these individuals are breaking. These groups, both the African Jews and the Jews of Africa, have long and complex histories which need to be respected, documented, and studied by the groups themselves so that they can thrive in the case of the former and survive in the case of the latter, both in their traditional environments and in the world. These groups called African Jews can thrive. They have not faced the vicissitudes that the Jews of Africa have faced. The Jews of Africa are on the verges of going into extinction. I do not mince words, I talk with facts and figures. So, their history is very important so that they can manage their present and manage their future. And, so that's why the work of these people is extremely important. The stories of these groups also need to be studied with respect by Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardi Jews, Israelis, and interested scholars. I mentioned the groups that are not on the fringes, even though it is strange that the Igbos at 50 million, with Rabbinic Judaism, which is a development from Omenana, growing fastest among the Igbos. I still wonder how the Igbos managed to be on the fringes, but let that be a discuss for another day. Very importantly, our positions and opinions help to shape how the groups themselves see themselves and the world. This is very important because what they say and we as scholars say or do not say matter and influences the decisions of policymakers. Scholars contributed to what I refer to, the state of Israel, a Supreme Court. The Supreme Court making rulings based on a scholarly recommendation that was not based on any kind of fact. A Hebrew University of Jerusalem historian or anthropologist who did not even claim that he had met an Igbo in his life, who did not even claim that he had studied anything about West Africa, who only claimed that he was familiar with the story of the Ethiopian Jews, wrote several things that are not based on any kind of facts about the Igbos and misled the Supreme Court of the State of Israel. And It offered a judgment which is egregiously wrong. And the first book I wrote after finishing my doctoral studies was a correction of a mistake made by many scholars and the Supreme Court of the State of Israel on the statuses of the languages that we call the Igbo and Hebrew languages. I had to just take on language first because many others are coming. I compared the Igbo and the Jewish religion. In no distant time, the results will come out. What my findings will also be published. If the Igbo and Hebrew languages are Semitic, if whatever the Hebrew language is what the Igbo language is. If the Hebrew language is a Semitic language, the Igbo language is a Semitic language. If the Hebrew language is a Kwa language, the Igbo language is a Kwa language. You need to read this book to see what I'm talking about. Go to Amazon and Barnes and Noble and find the book and read it. I produced it in January this year. You cannot understand the Hebrew Bible fully unless you know the language we call the Igbo language today and the culture that it is talking about. The culture that it represents, that is Omenana. There are so many things found in the Hebrew Bible that survives even in the English translations, which nobody in the world will understand unless they are Igbos. And you look at a language that expresses the visions, the worldview of the Hebrew Bible, and you say that that language and the language we call Hebrew today are not related. Apparently, mindful of what I'm recommending, Professor Michael Alexander, my mentor at the University of California, Riverside, and I, by the way, I shouldn't fail to mention this. I consider Alexander one of the greatest visionaries in the field of Jewish studies. He saw tomorrow. But no point in mentioning some of the things he saw. As they manifest, we'll begin to understand the things he has seen and worked to make reality. Both of us concentrated on anti-Semitism and genocide in sub-Saharan Africa in respect of the Jews of Africa. And this was what produced my dissertation entitled The Holocaust of Biafra, Anti-Semitism and Genocide in Sub-Saharan Africa. And to keep my foot on the pedal, to continue watering the ground, I have produced the following work: Igbophobia and Anti-Semitism, Interlocking Hatreds, under re-examination. What Chinua Achebe, the doyen of African literature, and Ngozi Chimamanda Adichie said about the Igbos, and what they would have said if the Igbos had been identified by more conventional terms. We must realize that when the Anak, hater of Jews, came up with the term anti-Semitism, he had exclusively the Germans and the Jews in Germany in mind. He did not have the groups like the Igbos in mind. But our findings reveal that the people who will be called anti-Semites because they hate the Jewish people, they hate Israelis, feel exactly the same way about the Igbo people. So, if you say that they are Igbophobes, because Igbos are in their focus, they feel exactly the same way about the Jews and the Israelis. And if you call them anti-Semites because the Jews are primary in their vision, you will also notice that they hate Igbos. Isn't this phenomenal? Isn't this unique? So, we proceed. These works are essential because the Igbos are better than Ibiri. An older Igbo man is called Oke Ibiri. If she's a woman, she's called Ibiri Ache. If this individual is young, he is or she is called Ibirinta, that is small Ibiri. My life has been about bringing out the truths about Igbos. Or better, the Ibiri, which is what the people have called themselves forever, are being destroyed gradually by hatred motivated by anti-Semitism, or if you like, Ibophobia. But only few scholars in Jewish studies want to recognize this. Crucially, the Nigerians who are called Ibophobes also hate Israelis and Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews. And there is evidence that people who will be called anti-Semites because they hate the latter also hate the Igbos. And in both cases, both the Igbos and Jews are conflated. To honor the legacies of those this presentation recognizes their hard work, have continued moving. Recently, I published about Agu. It was Agu that was the spirit that was both holy and evil, and which possessed King Saul. Igbo religion and culture knows much about this personality. Well, lastly, I talked about the Obadiah Alliance Bedim. Obadiah Alliance is the group that was founded by Yehonata Elazam Muta, Rabbi, PhD, that came out with the ruling that the Igbo people are lineal descendants of the Israelites. This group ruled that when Igbos practice Omenana and Jews practice Judaism, that these two groups should intermarry. This was essentially what I presented at this colloquium, organized by one of the doyens of Jewish studies, distinguished Professor Tudor Parfitt, who was my teacher at the Florida International University, Miami, Florida, and who interestingly taught Yehonatan Elazar Mota too. So you can call both of us students of Tudor Parfitt. Have a beautiful day.